Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and joining us again from Frankfurt, Germany is William Engdahl. He's the author of the new book, Gods of Money, Wall Street and the Death of the American Century. Thanks for joining us again, William.
Thank you, Paul.
So when we first started talking, it must be a couple of years ago, at the time, you, but also some other economists I was talking to, were talking about the perhaps imminent demise of the U.S. dollar. People were talking about how the relative stability of the EU and how the EU might become a kind of reserve currency. And things sure have not turned out that way. People have run to the U.S. dollar. The worse the crisis gets, the more T-bills people want. And the EU's a mess. So what happened?
Well, very clearly what's happened is U.S. policy is at this point to weaken the only potential rival as world reserve currency, because the U.S. economy, contrary to the Wall Street Journal green shoots of recovery of the Obama administration, the U.S. economy is by no means out of the woods. It's not even in the deepest part of the woods yet in terms of what's going to come down in the next years. So they have to, the deficits that are going to accumulate in the dollar zone are going to be staggering, and they have to make sure that there is no alternative on the horizon that could play the reserve currency role, because once the U.S. loses reserve currency role, the game is over. That there are two pillars of power in post-war U.S. Power, and that is one, the military power overall, and number two, the dollar is world reserve currency. As long as that's the case, the U.S. government can issue debt without limit, and the rest of the world has to swallow the inflation.
It's an unwinnable game, though, is it not? Because as the Americans do this, say they weaken the EU, and it leads to strengthening of the U.S. dollar, which means even more products flooding out of the EU as exports, less American products exported. And you wind up having more and more Americans with less jobs. So this whole engine seems completely unworkable, which is flooding back of American dollars throughout the world back into the United States, buying up enterprises, buying up T-bills and everything. But Americans have no real purchasing power to support the dollar. So where does all this end up?
Well, it's United States is going down the trail that Margaret Thatcher led Britain down 25 years ago, and Britain is no longer an industrial economy and hasn't been for some decades, and the United States is de facto rapidly going in that situation. As you point out, the out-migration of jobs to Asia, to cheap wage countries in the Americas as well as Eastern Europe, and or Africa, or almost anywhere except the United States. But since when do the gods of money care about their indigenous population? As long as they have walled, fenced-in communities and independent natural food supplies, let them eat cake is their view. I think that's the only interpretation one could put on it. Yeah, it's a very, very cynical thing that's going on, but they simply do not care about a domestic economy as long as they're the center of world power.
And they can have, if their investments in Asia can give them good or best returns, then they don't actually really care where those investments are, whether they're in Asia or in the United States.
Well, they let Pittsburgh become a rust heap back in the 70s and the 80s. They didn't have any concern about that. Revitalizing American industry and technological excellence, they didn't care about that. They outsourced everything as a conscious strategy because all they cared about was dollarization of the world economy. The center of the power is the dollar, as Kissinger said in the 70s. If you control money, you control the entire world, and that's the Gods of Money book was written as a third part in this Kissinger trilogy, if you will, the oil, the food, and the money.
So where's the UK in all this? The UK where is the pound, and what side of the barricades are the British going to be on here?
Well, the British seem to be indelibly locked on the Washington side or the Wall Street side of the barricades. I know some very senior bankers in London who are quite uncomfortable with that, but they don't see any alternative. Interestingly enough, in 1992, the British establishment had made an historic decision to go with the emerging Euro strategy of continental Europe, the French and Italy and the Germans and so forth, because their calculation was if we lock our wagon to the star of the emerging Euro, the City of London can play the premier role and actually challenge the power of Wall Street for the first time in the post-war period. Well, those dreams were dashed when a billionaire speculator broke the Bank of England by the name of George Soros. People who believe in the tooth fairy might believe that he gambled and was just a lucky lone gambler. Some people in London are convinced that he had very, very privileged information on the Achilles heel of the pound back in '92. Be that as it may, that was U.S. policy. The U.S. Wish was to prevent the City of London from joining forces with Germany, France, and the emerging Euro, the European Central Bank.
So if you have this train, and the train is make sure the American dollar stays dominant, make sure it's the world's reserve currency, which continues to drive down the exportability of American products and encourage the industrialization of everywhere else, and weakening of the purchasing power of American workers and people.
Yeah.
It seems that, like, we off camera, the two of us were joking about, well, who gets to call it? When does this train go over the cliff? I mean, whether it's 10 years or 30 years, I mean, China and Japan, I guess, are going to try to keep this train moving as long as they can. It still seems an untenuous situation, or am I missing something?
Well, it's dysfunctional. It's pathologically dysfunctional. The point is, I have never predicted the disappearance of the dollar. I mean, that would be silly. But the continual weakening of the dollar as the deficits mount, the economy further deteriorates into depression and so forth, a very tragic kind of unfolding that we're seeing before us. But the weakening of the dollar is a game that Wall Street and the so-called gods of money can play as long as they can create the paper that the rest of the world is willing to swallow. And so about the time the Greek crisis suddenly mirabile dictu erupted on the stage last November, the Chinese central bank and Chinese officials were talking about their growing concern about the value of their dollar investments. The Arab world, the OPEC countries, the Emirates and so forth, were getting very uneasy about their dollar holdings, and others around the world. And there were signs that the dollar was on the brink of a major decline, which would have weakened U.S. power projection dramatically. And just at that convenient moment, the scandals broke on Greece, and the attention turned from the dollar weakness to the question of Euroland weakness. So,
well, I think ordinary people have a sort of faith that the gods of money eventually will correct things in their own long-term interests. And I think maybe the mistake is the gods of money are thinking about today and tomorrow and not much further, because if you can cash in quick, it's like Goldman. Yeah. If you can cash in on your bonuses now, who cares what the company losses are later? After me come the floods.
Well, as Lloyd Blankfein said in that infamous interview in the London Times a few months ago, we're just simply doing God's work here on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs. That's their view, is you know, after me let the floods come, but you know, we're in here to accumulate power, and we'll do it at the expense of the American taxpayer, at the cost of trillions of dollars. We'll do it at the expense of the developing countries in Africa or Latin America. We don't care, as long as we get our leverage of power and increase that power. That's our agenda. So I think that's a fairly unviable strategy in the long run.
Thanks for joining us, William. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And don't forget the donate button over here, or if you in the United States, you text the word news to 85944 on your mobile phone. You'll be sending us $5. Thanks again.